Hello, everyone. We're just waiting for people to arrive. So we'll get started about 5 past. But thanks very much for joining us. We'll be with you shortly. So do we have to do like affected idle chat now whilst we wait for people to arrive?
I mean, the only idle chat that I will entertain is pro-Republican idle chat.
Like, but you need to specify what kind of Republican.
Ooh, yeah, true say. I mean, like, I guess I'm obligated, like, as a Pakistani ne'er-do-well to like be in line with Sinn Féin, but Sinn Féin could be like 7 different things, unfortunately.
Also, Sinn Féin be controversial on the radical left, aren't they?
Yeah, or like, I mean, if the radical left even knows about it in Britain, oh God, how depressing, right? Like,
well, the radical left in Britain always like periodically rediscovers Sinn Féin after like an election resulting in a hung parliament, and then like indulge in these like wild fantasies that like Irish Republicans are going to swear an oath of allegiance to the Queen.
Yeah.
Like, and then come in to like save the day or
yeah,
or whatever.
It's really glorious to watch these like British left fantasies of like hundreds of years of violent imperialism in Ireland will be somehow overwritten by like these MPs like forgiving the British and kind of helping. It's kind of beautiful in a way, but it's absurd. It's very naive.
I mean that's the kind of the bourgeois nonsense about it. Yeah, like everything is about like these like really stupid like acts of like David Cameron goes and just like fucking apologizes for some mass shooting in India like during the the independence movement, and then it's just like and then like British people are all just like, why are they still mad? like a man went over and apologized.
Yeah, although like I see that Pat Finucane's back in the High Court today, and I was kind of railing on Twitter about how that just doesn't seem to penetrate the British left at all. Like,
yeah,
like for anyone who doesn't know, Pat Finucane was a human rights lawyer who was murdered. The British state colluded with loyalist paramilitaries to murder him. And David Cameron said like, oh yeah, like there was collusion, and sorry, we can't kind of really give you a proper inquiry because like spooks. And yeah, the British left, I guess, for like, I mean, the Guardian isn't covering it on its front page or anything. No. I guess it's just too difficult for the British left to kind of process, to think that like, oh, people think of the empire being this historic thing, and yet when you like Northern Ireland really, or like the north of Ireland really complicates that picture, because it's like this weird vestigial like actual colony. And so I feel like it really messes with people's heads in the British left, because people on the British left are trying to seize the British state, but they're not thinking through, okay, so what is your attitude towards the fact that that state is still in 6 counties and its sovereignty there is contested? And like one way, it's a liberal framing, but one way of conceptualizing that is that something like 35% of the parliamentary constituencies in that jurisdiction are contested by Sinn Féin. Like, what does that say to your claim to sovereignty whenever the parliament is so central? Anyway, I could waffle on about this indefinitely, but
do you have a passionate opinion about Ireland, Frank?
No, it's very dispassionate. This is merely a factual like exposition. Like, I have no particular dog in the fight, and anyone who tells you otherwise is lying. I think we're good to crack on. It's 4 minutes past. I'll give people 1 more minute to arrive. I think we've still got some people arriving, and then we'll kick things off. Okay, let's just get started. So thank you very much, everyone, for joining us tonight for what promises to be a very interesting panel discussion. The event itself is going to be hosted by my friend and comrade Zainab, who I'll hand over to momentarily. But I'm just going to introduce the event by saying a few words about the host, London Learning Cooperative, and give you a bit of insight into the format. So I should start by saying that the event is being recorded, although you'll have noticed that we've adopted this webinar format, which means that the video emphasis, so to speak, is on the speakers. If you want to participate, there will be a Q&A session at the end of the formal speeches or contributions, and you should see a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. So if you want to raise questions during the event, you can do that using the Q&A function, and then we'll have collated them at the end, and we can ask the panelists and convey those questions to them. There is also a chat function, so feel free to use the chat function throughout the event. But if you want to specifically ask a question, please do use the Q&A function. We'll aim to be done by about, I'd say 7:30 at the latest London time. There's a bit of flexibility there and we can see how we go, but I'm conscious that it's a Friday night. A few words about London Learning Cooperative then. London Learning Cooperative began properly operating earlier this year. We're a workers' cooperative sort of tuition agency and radical pedagogical experiment. We're actually in the process of considering whether to rename the project from London Learning Cooperative to the Learning Cooperative, because it is truly a global project. And in that connection, we have tutors and educators in places like Pakistan, like Gaza, Lebanon, in the 6 counties in Ireland, in London, in France, in Venezuela, Brazil. So we have this expanding international network of people who come together to create a space to think critically about education, to learn languages together. And we're also trying to expand beyond the learning, language acquisition into other areas of kind of intellectual inquiry. And it's in that connection that we've organized this event tonight. Zainab deserves all of the credit for kind of conceptualizing it, and I've helped to host and to realize it. And it's worth mentioning as well that if you're interested in what we're trying to do with London Learning Cooperative, I'd encourage you to visit our website and to find us on social media. So it's londonlearningcoop.com. I can post this in the chat. And those who no doubt find Zainab's contribution incredibly insightful and interesting tonight will be interested to know that Zainab's going to be hosting a 10-week Islamic philosophy course, which is upcoming. We're going to announce that in the next day or two. So watch this space, and if you're interested in signing up to that course, there'll be details again on social media. That is due to start on Monday, the 26th of October, and the first session will be from 7 to 8:30 p.m. So that is London Learning Cooperative, and I think that's all that we need to hear from me. So without further ado, let me pass over to Zainab, who can provide a bit of an introduction to tonight's panel, and then he can introduce she can introduce the speakers. Just one moment whilst I spotlight you. Zainab, over to you.
Hi, everyone. Well, it's great to be speaking to everybody during this strange time that we're in. Obviously, this would be more ideal as a panel if we could be in person, but also like the opportunity to do something virtually between different people in the US and in Britain and in Ireland, and with such an international remit in terms of the topic is more than welcome. I first of all just want to remind you about the Islamic philosophy course that we will be starting at the London Learning Cooperative, now renamed, very soon. If you have any questions about that, you can definitely get in touch with either Frank or me, or you can go on the London Learning Cooperative website, and it will announce further details very soon. I'm very excited to give the course, and I'm sure you will be very excited to receive that wisdom from me. It's a little bit of a joke. Like, obviously that's going to be more of a discussion format, because I just don't understand why I would imbibe you with knowledge, or why I would expect something like that. Before I introduce speakers, I just want to give a few general points that will frame this discussion. Firstly, that abortion politics is fundamentally about organizing how people have sex and why. I say this in contrast to how abortion is often talked about in more liberal and conservative framings in the United States, which is whether or not one is choosing something of free will, which is itself dubious for a number of reasons, as well as whether or not someone is protecting life, right? Like all of these like words and all this language that liberals and conservatives will use in terms of freedom of women's choice over their bodies, as you know, on the other side, like protecting life kind of mystifies what's really going on here, right? Abortion isn't about life, and although it is on some level about choice, like that sort of thought takes you away from the fact that abortion is a politics of who must and must not have sex, and sex being fundamentally a process that is meant to result in children. So it becomes about who must have sex, and then that results in children, and then who must not have sex with having children, because them having children is somehow threatening, right? So all of this is to say that mass sterilization is on the same political spectrum as forced birth as a result of abortion restrictions. And ultimately, abortion policy organizes people relative to ruling class ambitions, so, like often in the marketplace, but generally relative to how a certain population overlaps with dominant ideas about what families are supposed to look like and what the nation is supposed to look like. And the second point is about imperialism and what it is. I'm not going to wax philosophical to you about this, like we don't have time. This could be itself a multi-week course at the London Learning Cooperative. All I want to say is to remind you that imperialism has both economic and non-economic dimensions. Leftists often look for how empire boosts profitability, but this overlaps the many times when it doesn't boost profitability overall, even if profitability goes up in certain sectors of the economy. The Iraq War is a perfect example of this. Like leftists often presume that war was about oil, but the reality is that it's way more complicated, and fitting with the topic and the fact that Séagh will be speaking later, one of the main beneficiaries of the Iraqi oil boom that followed the invasion, in terms of total consumption, was China, right? So imperialism results in contradictory, like in Marxian terms, in regular person language, imperialism results in different kinds of situations, and sometimes what seems profitable for one section of the economy of a certain country might not be profitable for the whole of the country overall. For much of European history, imperialism has actually been more of a drain than it has been profitable. The East India Company, which impacts what I'll be talking about in Pakistan and Afghanistan, was perpetually in debt, actually. It's constantly had finance troubles. Its terrible finances were brought up over and over again in attempts to nationalize the East India Company under the British Crown, and then eventually that happened as a result of the 1857 uprising. So, to wrap this up quickly, it's important to think about profits, obviously, when it comes to imperialism, but it's also important to talk about ideology and institutional costs that are required for market capitalism on a large scale that may not ultimately be all that profitable. And I think that matters for talking about abortion, because you can't really understand how empire frames abortion politics on a global scale and with massive differences within countries as well. Some people being encouraged to give birth without abortion, some people being forced through abortion, if you constantly try to think about a lens of profitability, because sometimes that is profitable, sometimes it makes sense for capitalism in terms of profit, other times it makes sense for capitalism in terms of non-profitable forms of imperial administration. I just want you to think with a little more nuance. And with that, I will quickly just introduce the speakers. There's obviously me. I'm a freelance journalist, at least I try to be, and I'm a doctoral student, again, I try to be, at Séagh University of London, and I specialized in Northwest Pakistan, and therein with various kinds of armed and unarmed movements. I'm going to be speaking on this panel with Jenny Brown. Jenny has released a book recently called Without Apology, The Abortion Struggle Now. That's from Verso Books. And Jenny organizes with National Women's Liberation. And I will also be speaking with Séagh Kehoe, who is a postdoctoral research fellow at the University of Westminster, and Séagh has a PhD in contemporary Chinese studies from the University of Nottingham in the International Relations Department. So with that, I will give it over to Jenny, who will start. Over to you.
Hello, everyone. Thanks so much for putting this together, Zainab and Frank and the London Learning Cooperative for hosting this, because it comes at a critical time where the entire US establishment views China as the global rival, right? This includes the woman who is likely to be Joe Biden's defense secretary, should Joe Biden win the presidency. Her name is Michelle Flournoy, and she's already calling for a stronger military in the US to deal with China. So in the US, it's a growing bipartisan consensus that China is a threat to US world domination, I think correctly. China's officials, of course, say they want a multipolar world, but that is not acceptable to US officials. So related to this, the US establishment, both major parties have been worried about the fact that the US currently has its lowest birth rate ever. And many officials directly relate this to the difficulty of military recruitment and the US's ability to forestall the emergence of challenges. Recent US restrictions on abortion and birth control should be seen in that light. All these anxieties have recently been pulled together in a book by Matt Iglesias, who is a liberal co-founder of Vox. The book is called 1 Billion Americans, in which he argues for tripling the US population to counter the threat of China. No, this is sort of sounds like a kind of a frivolous proposal, but I do think that it channels a lot of what is really going on in the establishment. So how did we get to this point? I'll give a little history. Rulers throughout history have generally desired larger populations, and this has been true throughout the modern world until it was questioned by leftists and by socialist countries who have actually implemented policies allowing abortion and birth control starting in the early 20th century. The US, of course, is no exception, and being a settler country has always placed a high priority on the importation of workers and on their reproduction. While forcing reproduction by enslaved Africans, they always made sure to import Europeans to keep from being outnumbered by enslaved people or people who are of African descent. And this became especially urgent to them after the Haitian Revolution starting in 1791. Early in the 20th century, as the US was developing into a full-blown empire, US feminists argued that women were being induced to have children to provide troops for an insatiable military machine. Sociologist Leda Hollingworth wrote in 1916 of various, as she called them, devices being used to impel US women to, quote, produce and rear families large enough to admit of national warfare being carried on and of colonization, unquote. The primary device she listed was the drastic Comstock law, which had outlawed abortion and birth control, and even any information on or medical discussion of birth control in 1873. And that law lasted until 1973, so for a century. At the time Leda Hollingworth was writing, Theodore Roosevelt provided grounds for this feminist accusation by saying, if our birth rate continues to diminish, and at that point it was quite high, we will, by the end of the century, be impotent in the face of powers like Germany, Russia, or Japan. We shall have been passed by the great states of South America. So you can see some of the anxieties there. Now, but the US is sort of famous for imposing birth control on other countries. So I want to go into the history in the 50s and 60s. So it was only in the 50s and 60s with anti-colonial movements kicking out European powers, leftist revolutionaries taking power in several countries, including China in 1949, US rulers started to panic about overpopulation. They worried about it inside the US since we had a long baby boom, quite a bit longer than the other countries that were engaged in World War II. And then the population panic was also related to the demographic transition that was occurring in many countries with sanitation, vaccinations, antibiotics, leading to a lower death rate while the birth rate was still holding steady. So that led to leaps in population. And this was particularly disconcerting to some in the US when it happened in countries with revolutionary movements. One of the major promoters of the population panic in the 1950s in the US, Hugh Moore, who was made his billions with the Dixie Cup Corporation, he placed ads that read, a world with mass starvation in underdeveloped countries will be a world of chaos, riots, and war, and a perfect breeding ground for communism. We cannot afford half a dozen Vietnams or even one more. So starting in the 50s, the United States and various, usually through private foundations, set up population control measures aimed at developing countries, hoping to forestall revolutions. It imposed forced sterilization on poor people in the United States and in Puerto Rico. And for example, worried that India might have a revolution like China, the United States funded programs there to sterilize young men, and things that we're all very familiar with. But I don't think that we're as familiar with what happened then, which is that the population panic passed in the early 70s, partly because revolutions either happened or they were being stalled almost everywhere, including the Black Rebellion within the United States. So, and also the baby boom had ended rather abruptly in the US. So our birth rate had been 3.5 in 1960, 3.5 children per woman. And it was close to 2, which is sort of close to replacement level by the mid 70s. So now the US birth rate is the lowest it's ever been. It's 1.76, which sounds a little higher than the European context, but it's the lowest it's ever been in the United States. And what we've been seeing in the last 20 or 30 years is the establishment increasingly worrying that the population is shrinking, it's going to be too low. Population is not actually shrinking, but they worry about this. They worry about the age ratio, but they also worry about national defense, as they call it, which is offense. So you have several strains of this in the U.S. You have the paleocons. Maybe people have heard of Patrick Buchanan, for example. He calls oral contraceptives the suicide pill of the West. So his big thing is that he's afraid Mexico will reclaim its lands from the United States. Then you have neocons, such as those involved in the post-Cold War Project for a New American Century. They want to build up US forces and have plenty of troops on hand to police the world. In 2002, neoconservative Harvard professor Stephen Peter Rosen wrote, quote, "Our goal is not combating a rival, but maintaining our imperial position and maintaining imperial order. The maximum amount of force can and should be used as quickly as possible for psychological impact to demonstrate that the empire cannot be challenged with impunity." And then you have the neoliberals like Hillary Clinton, who as Secretary of State wanted a pivot to Asia, which means let's shore up our bases around China, essentially. And you can see some of that happening with new arms sales to Taiwan. But in the immediate period following the fall of the Soviet Union, US forces took on massive new, what they considered responsibilities. A 1992 defense guidance document defined the US objective as new regional defense strategy that requires we endeavor to prevent any hostile power from dominating a region whose resources would, under consolidated control, be sufficient to generate global power. So this is kind of their view of this. And in that period, the United States increased the number of overseas military bases from 800 to 1600, so they were doubled. And then the US now maintains military bases in at least 80 countries, up from 40, and that would include multiple bases in Okinawa, South Korea, the Philippines, Singapore, obviously Afghanistan, Guam, Australia, smaller presences in Thailand and Cambodia. All of these different factions of the US ruling class agree that the US needs a larger military to keep up with all of these garrisons and occupations. So there's a question though, does that necessarily mean more people are required in the military? And there was a period around 1991 when, you know, there was this idea in the US military that troops could be replaced with technology. By 2010, the Army had concluded that that was no longer, they had figured out that it didn't work. Here's a quote from a 2010 Army document. With the end of the Cold War, a prominent theory arose that there would no longer be a need for large land forces, that power projection and national military strategy could primarily be carried out through precision strikes using technologically advanced air and naval forces. This standoff approach would reduce the level of US involvement and commitment, and thus the requirement for large land forces. Reality proved that theory to be invalid. So they concluded that to carry out all of the US government's objectives, they still needed troops. Now, it's generally agreed among the military brass that the Iraq War, with the combined with various other base building and whatnot that the US was doing, really stretched the military to the breaking point. Army tours were extended from 12 months to 15 months. Troops were returned to war zones 3 and sometimes 4 times. The military had trouble meeting its recruitment goals, despite offering increased enlistment bonuses, $40,000 to enlist, $65,000 additionally, and money for college. But recruiters kept falling short of their targets. They had intense pressure put on them to recruit, and then the recruiters in turn bullied the people they were trying to recruit. And that resulted in a lot of abuse and also mental breakdowns and suicides among the recruiters. It caused a whole crisis. This is in 2007, 2008 that really came to a head. But neoliberals and neoconservatives agree on adding troops. Project for a New American Century, the Liberal Center for American Progress, across the aisle, they all agree. They don't necessarily agree on how to get those troops. Neoliberals generally support increased immigration, and they offer citizenship if you serve in the military. They propose reinstituting the draft. In the case of the Center for American Progress, proposed this. And then the neocons and the paleocons are obviously opposed to abortion and birth control. So there's neocons are somewhat split. Paleocons are definitely opposed to abortion and birth control. And then there's a group called the reformicons, I know, US politics, which want an increase in social spending to increase the birth rate, but also oppose abortion. So this would be people like Paul Ryan, Senator Mike Lee, a group called, impossibly named, the Young Guns Network. So all of this has gone hand in hand with accelerating restrictions on abortion and attempts to make it harder for people to get contraception. That usually means making it more expensive, keeping insurance companies from covering it. And it's likely that our birth rate in the US would be, is much higher than it would be if we had complete control. Our unintended birth rate is about twice that of countries that have good access through national health systems like France. 1 in 3 births in the US is unintended at this point. And in Texas, where the restrictions and regulations closed 82 family planning clinics after 2011, the birth control use went down and childbearing rose 27% for women in the affected areas compared to areas that still had those clinics. So you can see that there is pressure for births, and it's been working to some extent. And with the Supreme Court, assuming this new Supreme Court justice gets approved, the Supreme Court is very likely to allow states to ban abortion. And in the US, about half of states are poised to do that. So Matt Yglesias, with his 1 Billion Americans book, has kind of been saying out loud what others have been hinting at with their think tank reports and their op-eds. Though he's a bit more brazen about it, he says, the US needs to triple its population to keep up with China. Not to keep up militarily, you understand, because Yglesias believes he's a very nice guy and he's very concerned about ethics. But if China has grown rich and big, the US has to grow much richer and much bigger. Of course, if you scratch the surface of why he wants 1 billion Americans, he keeps harking back to US population and manufacturing might during World War II. So he's really talking about military capacity. His idea is to shore up social programs to make childbearing more affordable, which of course everybody would be for national childcare system. But he's for letting in more of what he terms the right immigrants, and who he imagines will just love to be in the US after our performance on COVID. I can imagine that maybe that might not be so. And then further, in his view, competing with China will bring the left and the right together in a wonderful program of national unity against this threat. So the China bashing and the hatred, and we've been the U.S. Population has been bombarded with anti-China stuff for the last year, and it's really had an effect on people's opinions of China. It's the lowest it's been in decades, really. So criticism of handling COVID, the Hong Kong protests, Uyghurs, a new lurid documentary on the one-child policy, which manages to blame son preference on the one-child policy. Anyway, the US public has been bombarded with this stuff, but it goes hand in hand with the anti-abortion politics and the encouragement of higher birth rates. So that's all I've got.
Well, thank you very much for that, Jenny. I will be speaking next, and then we'll turn this over to Séagh. Before I speak, I just want to say something about this like a thing with cybernetic soldiers, which was alluded to by Jenny, when she talked about technology, kind of bridging the gap when it comes to lower recruitment numbers. So there is a way that I know this that I won't explicitly say, but the debate about that, about introducing technology into the United States Armed Forces, that you see in different branches through these 2020 plans. So there's a Marines 2020 plan, Air Force 2020, Navy 2020. These 2020 modernization plans are mainly about taking on not just China, but also Russia. You have to remember that the United States has been mainly fighting insurgent wars for the last 25 or 30 years. So a lot of the US military apparatus isn't actually well designed for fighting other states. And at the same time, Russia and China have been themselves modernizing their militaries while not actually fighting insurgencies in the same way as the United States. Obviously, Russia has been in China, but I'm not China, Chechnya rather. But that's not the same as, say, the 2003 invasion of Iraq, or what NATO member states have been doing in Afghanistan. So just to quickly wrap that point up, the problem with technology in the US Armed Forces is, one, that the technology isn't really as good as the Pentagon would want it to be, particularly when it comes to decision making. But the second problem, and this is something that I really want everyone to remember, because it's like a really active part of the debate right now, is that there's a serious problem democratically and ethically, but also like just in the Constitution of the United States, with fully automating certain functions of the armed forces, and particularly functions when it comes to killing, right? So those of you who know about how drone strikes actually work know that drone pilots have to kind of be sitting in center, say in Texas, or like throughout the United States, and suffer like extreme mental health problems because they're operating drones from like thousands and thousands of kilometers away. The reason they need to do that is, one, the technology doesn't exist to automate that process, but also because of what it means to automate the process of killing. So ultimately, at the end of the day, like the United States hasn't actually gotten to a technological point, but also a political point where it can fully automate the process of killing people. It still needs people to make those decisions. And unfortunately, the technology will exist soon that a machine can make those decisions. And I just want you to think about that, right? Like, because that's foreign to like us right now at this lecture in 2020, but it's worth remembering the Air Force was once a foreign idea to people 150 years ago, and then it wasn't foreign when it became normal. So now I want to talk about the Afghan and Pakistani perspective on this. I'll start with Pakistan. Pakistan carries a colonial era ban from the British period. Section 312 of the Indian Penal Code of 1860 bans something called induced miscarriage. That is instilled in Pakistani law from the Indian period. As many of you know, as my parents would love to deny, Pakistan emerged from India, right? India has actually taken steps against this colonial era law. Pakistan has not, for a number of complex reasons that like I can't really discuss here because it's just like a very complicated topic. I only really have around 12 minutes for this. But the important thing is like the timing of it, right? So the Indian Penal Code of 1860 bans induced miscarriage. It also bans a bunch of other stuff. It has a blasphemy ban, which is very, very interesting. One that I would love to talk to people about at another time, because that ban on blasphemy effectively extends a Christian Protestant vocabulary about what blasphemy is, itself impacted by the Catholic Church in Europe, and it fuses it with an Islamic political vocabulary, except that in Islamic law, the category of blasphemy doesn't exist. So it's a European construct of blasphemy that now exists in Pakistani law, seemingly about Islam, right? But like, it's amazing. Like a bunch of us are just running around enforcing like a Protestant restriction on blasphemy, and but we're like using this like Islamic language. I say we. Well, I don't know what I mean. I'm sitting here in Kenosha, Wisconsin. I'm not. I don't have anything to do with that blasphemy law. But you know what I'm trying to say. Like and I also want to make clear that the Indian Penal Code also bans homosexuality and other things basically on the same lines, right? It was a document that was written in 1860 in line with Protestant British, largely Anglican, not just Anglican. There's Presbyterianism and like Methodism and a lot of other stuff going on as well. Catholicism a little bit, it should also be said. Like the Penal Code was written in line with those values imposed into law, right? So the Indian Penal Code of 1860 was meant to structure society in relation to Protestant ideas about how society should look. And the induced miscarriage section of that law, similar to the bans on homosexuality, similar to the bans on various different kinds of gender deviance, were meant to impose a particular kind of societal arrangement on Indian society. So why did they do that? Why in 1860? Well, there was a massive military uprising in 1857. This is called the Sepoy Mutiny. technically, because, you know, like, it's like, how dare they, like, mutiny type of thing. These, when we say Sepoy Mutiny, like, one should think about it as an uprising that started in the private militaries of the East India Company. And the reason that started is because of a really small dispute, which is that you used to, like, in muskets, you used to need to bite the bullets and then before you load them. And the British gave everybody these bullets that had pig and beef fat in them. And various soldiers, like, objected based on their religious restrictions. And then the British officers tried to force them to do it. And then this ended up triggering a massive backlash, which developed into a general uprising in 1857 that, like, ripped through the Indian subcontinent and took years for the British colonial authorities to actually put down. And the effects of that uprising, which was not that far away from, if you have to remember the context of the time. There were also, like, contemporary uprisings in Ireland and in Montego Bay in Jamaica. The uprising in India was the most impactful, and the results were that the East India Company was disbanded and nationalized under the British Crown. Queen Victoria became the Empress of India, and the British Parliament took direct legislative responsibility for colonial holdings in India. Whereas before then, it was a lot more complicated. Technically, the British weren't administering India, even though the emperor was powerless, and the East India Company had outflanked all its European rivals, notably France, in order to basically dominate the whole show. So 1860 was an Indian penal code that was passed, and abortion was banned as part of this general push to structure society on lines that would not lead to another uprising like happened in 1857. Therefore, Pakistani law carries this colonial impulse to ban abortion as a way of structuring a society so that it doesn't engage in anti-colonial and anti-imperial uprising. So that is to say that abortion and fighting, like, and armed fighting, like, it must be said, like shooting, are linked, like, not just in the British colonial imagination, but now as a result in the Pakistani legal imagination, and in particular the Pakistani military's legal imagination. There's a reason that abortion law hasn't actually changed in Pakistan. Like, the colonial era laws, as is also the case with homosexuality, with other kinds of things, but the blasphemy law still serves a useful purpose for structuring society. So now Afghanistan. In Afghanistan, abortion is actually slightly more liberal than it is in Pakistan, but, like, not by much. When I say slightly more liberal, Afghanistan and Pakistan both, you can actually get an abortion if it's to save the mother's life. Afghanistan is a little bit different in Pakistan in that Afghanistan has technically abortion access if their fetus has a disability. And rarely in Afghanistan, which is not the case in Pakistan, you can actually, you might be able to get an abortion if you can prove that you're too poor. This is based on a complex justification in Islamic ethics, but again, within a Protestant political vocabulary, right? Because you need to prove yourself before a religious council. Although Afghanistan wasn't directly colonized by the British, this is kind of like a very British construct. You have to prove yourself to this council of people who are well versed in the religion. There are Islam has a tradition of learned elders and that just know the books really well, right? But in terms of policing moral matters, that's a Protestant idea, right? So again, I want to emphasize this, right? In Afghanistan, even with a slightly more liberal like abortion law, you still have a situation, even though it wasn't directly colonized, where this idea of using like different kinds of law, including ones related to abortion, to structure society on certain lines holds true, right? Like, and in Afghanistan, part of the reason you do that is to hold a very like diverse and in some ways very unstable. Although I will say that the main reason Afghanistan is unstable is because of certain countries in the world, right? Britain and the United States, like among them, but also like there's a complicated matter with the Soviet Union. But again, abortion law structures Afghanistan, helps keep it together, like in addition to other kinds of law, based on how morality structures the society at large, and morality is decided in XYZ manners, and XYZ manners includes a certain policy on abortion that is itself basically a Protestant Christian one. Like, I realize that's complicated. There's a reason I keep kind of emphasizing these points before I even go into like the brunt of what I want to say. Like, I want you to ask in the Q&A if you have questions about it. Like, I know that like kind of thinking about abortion in this way is not really the way that like a lot of Americans in particular are used to regarding abortion. So like, please ask if you find this a little bit complicated. Okay, so I want to talk about the fact that, as I said, British abortion law structures abortion access in such a way that helps deepen colonial rule, like, and helps make certain administrative ambitions possible in 19th century India. Like, that continues in Pakistan today in different ways, and continues in Afghanistan today. Like, the United States is a little different in terms of how it structures moral behavior and how it like uses the law. The reason I say that is because like, I mean, you definitely get US conservative groups that back like problematic laws abroad, like financially and otherwise. This was recently the case with a really devastating homosexuality ban in Uganda that was passed in large part with assistance from evangelical groups in the United States, right? Like, there's like another sinister problem though, which is that the United States like tends to impose certain restrictions on abortion through limits on foreign aid, and that's been the approach since the 1970s. So, like many of the people who are here will know about the Hyde Amendment, which was passed in 1977 by the United States Congress. Like, it could actually be repealed at any time. It's like an amendment on Jenny can or somebody else can correct me if I'm wrong about this. As far as I know, it's an amendment on the budgetary bill that is passed in the United States Congress. Like, there's what's less known, unfortunately, is that the Helms Amendment was passed in 1973, almost right after Roe v. Wade, and the Helms Amendment limits foreign aid from the United States to be used for abortion. What does that do? As I've tried to tell you before, the fundamental purpose of law is meant to structure human behavior, and in the like relation to abortion law, it's meant to structure the way that people have sex and structure particular ideas of family and nation. So what's telling about the US approach here is that it's not necessarily trying to deepen abortion restrictions in Pakistan and Afghanistan, though conservatives back like bans like on various kinds of amoral behavior, right? Like, but rather that it tends to impose morality through restricting financing to certain kinds of activity. So like, that is to say that the imperial approach here by the United States is to use finance to impose Protestant Christian morality in a similar way to how the classical European approach during the heyday of European imperialism, unfortunately that's over, am I right? Like imposed morality through like a more direct legal approach. Part of the reason why is those old laws are on the books. Part of the reason why is that the US tends to use financing and other indirect means to impose its will on other countries, because capitalism is currently in a phase where like the old school approach of direct imperial administration in many of these countries is not really the way to go, right? So the practical result of the Helms Amendment has been that when it comes to like non-governmental organizations that operate in Afghanistan and Pakistan, like recently the language is NGOs. Obviously, if you go back decades, like people call these different things, family planning organization or whatever. The state used to be more direct in how it handled these things. I just add that as a necessary like asterisk. But the result is that Afghan and Pakistani groups that deal with various kinds of reproductive health matters and family planning matters, which includes abortion, tend to need to split their financing streams between European and US sources. And they tend to need to like split up how organizationally they work, so that the European and Australasian financing, Australasian meaning like mainly like Australia, New Zealand, like financing is that which is used for abortion, whereas like the US financing like it funds all these other initiatives, but the US financing can't end up in abortion. Like those of you who work in the who are in the United States and work in healthcare or whatever will recognize what I'm talking about, right? Like because that is more like has increasingly been since Roe v. Wade passed the reality in much of the United States when it comes to actually getting the financing that you need to make abortion a reality for people, particularly if you're working at Planned Parenthood, for example. Like that started abroad, like well, abroad for you like Americans, right? Like and it started as a result of the Helms Amendment, which bled into the Hyde Amendment. So you know, like as an aside, like you know, like what happens with abortion financing abroad inevitably affects like what happens with it at home, and that's like a classically like left-wing argument, right? That it's like the domestic and the foreign aren't really something you could separate, right? You have to care about things abroad. Part of the reason you have to care about things abroad is because like what you see as abroad impacts what you see as home, right? So I will conclude by noting to you that the Trump administration wants to expand the Helms Amendment. This was recently announced. Like, so that what would happen is that a company can't, like, a company or group, whatever, can't take US foreign financing if it gives out abortion care at all, right? So this previous approach that Afghan and Pakistani groups have been doing, where you kind of split like the financing streams so that the US money doesn't end up in anything related to abortion, like it can't really work if Trump is reelected and this scheme ends up being passed. What would need to then happen is that you have completely separate organizations that are somehow under the same like informal umbrella that are specifically dedicated to abortion. Right? Like, and this just makes it harder and harder and harder to make abortion care a reality in Afghanistan and Pakistan. And I will say to you that it needs to be more accessible, obviously, not less accessible, because the reality of the matter is that, I mean, like, it's impossible to know this for certain, right? But but abortions are very common in Pakistan and Afghanistan, regardless of whether they are actually given out safely and by way of proper healthcare mechanisms, right? And when I say proper healthcare mechanisms, I'm not necessarily saying you have to go to a hospital to do it, right? I mean, whatever, take some roots that are ground up in a little easel, get rid of your pregnancy. The problem here is that healthcare is so inaccessible, particularly in the area of Pakistan that I study, the northwestern Pakistani region bordering Afghanistan, that what ends up happening is extremely dark, right? People induce their own miscarriages in a variety of ways that are quite dangerous. One of which ends up actually, it's more and more common, and has been since the 80s, to just sprinkle some opium on a stick of bamboo or a stick of wood, and then you just stick that up into the fetal sac. It bursts it, and then you just drag it out, right? That's the reality for a lot of pregnant people who are among my research subjects. It's devastating and it's terrible, right? The only way to do that, to deal with that, is to first of all repeal abortion law in Pakistan and Afghanistan altogether. And I personally think laws should be repealed rather than made more liberal. We can talk about that in the Q&A if you like. And then also to deal with the fact that there are clear differences in development between Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Britain and the United States as a result of imperial inequality, and lift these bans on financing to provide, to build healthcare infrastructure that can provide things like abortion to people in a safer and more accessible way, but also just build healthcare infrastructure in general so that people, especially in Northwest Pakistan and especially in Afghanistan, have the ability to access the things they need without necessarily having to resort to what I just described, like fucking sprinkling opium on a stick. It's just it's mad. It's mad. So that's it from me for this segment. We can talk a little bit more about this in the Q&A. I will turn this over to Séagh.
Okay. So hi folks, it's very good to be with you, and big thanks to the comrades at London Learning Cooperative for putting this together, and for inviting me to speak to you about abortion at empire in Ireland and China. So I'll start by saying something about Ireland. I'll speak about China a little bit later. But I guess the obvious link between abortion and empire across the island of Ireland was Section 58 and 59 of the Offences Against the Person Act. That was enacted by Westminster in 1861. And this act situated abortion as an issue of criminal law, right? So it made it a crime for anyone who procured an abortion. And that person could be sentenced to life imprisonment for that. And so the Offences Against the Person Act, it became one of the most influential legislative frameworks on abortion around the world, and it facilitated that institutionalization of abortion criminalization at a global level. And it's had an enormous, as many of you know, it's had an enormous everlasting global impact. Jamaica, Malawi, for example, all still have abortion laws almost identical to the Offences Against the Person Act's original wording, so prohibiting abortion in almost all cases. And Ireland is also one of those contexts where the Offences Against the Person Act has played out. And it's been, as Zainab was talking about, a kind of a key way of deepening colonial rule, right? A way of imposing a very particular kind of morality across Irish society. And so even after the establishment of the Irish Republic, some version of the Offences Against the Person Act stayed in place, it remained on the books. And I think it's really important to think about the place of anti-abortion policy in the Irish state. So it became very much part of a broader effort to define Irish national identity as distinctly Catholic. But it was also very much tied up with the ways in which the nation, the Irish nation, had been gendered in a very particular way, partly because of, but not entirely because of, the Irish colonial experience. So the Irish nation was depicted as feminized, as vulnerable to aggressive and violent Irish men, and in need, of course, of the British state's protection. And so as a result of that, motherhood became kind of a key theme for Irish nationalists that evoked this idea of trauma and martyrdom in the past. And of course, women's dedication to reproducing the next generation of Irish people was also a core feature of Irish nationalism. And so all of this kind of became elevated to the symbol of Ireland's moral and cultural distinctiveness from and over Britain. But nonetheless, abortion still took place, whether legal or not, as it often does, as it always does. So backstreet clinics, for example, and other forms of abortion were common. People with money, of course, also have access, always had access to safer forms of abortion, more local forms of abortion. During the 1960s and 1970s in Ireland, those conversations around abortion started to change, and that was partly, largely in response to Roe v. Wade in the United States and the Abortion Act 1967 in England and Wales, and other forms of abortion liberalisation across Europe. And that put in place a lot of, it made reactionaries very fearful that it was only a matter of time before something similar might be introduced in Ireland. And so that led to a massive campaign in the 1970s and 1980s to enshrine in law anti-choice policy, the anti-choice amendment into the Irish Constitution. And so that anti-choiceness really became a symbol of Irishness in the 1980s, and it really kind of merged historical associations between Catholicism and Irish nationalism for a new era. And it's here that the Irish colonial experience became a way to justify the effort to keep Ireland abortion free, right, in a very Irish way. And so one of the, just to give you an example of how those colonial experiences came to justify that effort to keep Ireland abortion free, I found one of the pro-amendment posters from the 1980s that was displayed during the pro-life amendment campaign. And it had the following slogan: "The abortion mills of England grind Irish babies into blood that cries out to heaven for vengeance." And this slogan, it clearly constructs abortion as a weapon that England uses against that England was using against Ireland. It was kind of the language that became associated with abortion and invoked all kinds of memories of violent and bloody struggle between a colonizing England and a colonized Ireland. And those references to abortion then were also a means by which were constructed as a means through which the English would control the Irish population growth. And then again, evoking all kinds of ideas of the Irish famine. And so that was very much the 1980s, but that similar slogans could still be seen in recent years when we had the referendum to repeal that amendment in 2018. So still that kind of colonial experience was still a very much a central part of the anti-choice rhetoric across Ireland. But also converging with all kinds of new networked evangelical discourses, right? So that anti-abortion financing from abroad having a very major impact on the ways in which the Irish referendum played out. And so all of that is it's a way of thinking about those long-term, the complex impact of British Empire and the Offences Against the Person Act from 1861, how that has impacted reproductive rights in the Republic of Ireland, how it continues to do so. And the enduring impact of empire on reproductive justice. And that's even more pronounced in lots of different ways in the occupied 6 counties because of the way in which the government is organized there, because of devolved government. And I guess I was also thinking about when we think about how empire and abortion converge in the Irish experience, it makes me think about the kind of long histories of shared struggle between activists north and south when it comes to reproductive injustice. And during the repeal, the referendum to repeal the 8th in 2018, those, there was so much campaigning cross-border campaigning between feminist activists, and it was something I think that also enabled new opportunities for many people who hadn't thought about it previously, for about how a united Ireland might come into being. So it was quite an exciting way to think about how feminist activism around reproductive justice came to be so entangled with questions of challenging imperialism. And so, you know, I want to also say that, you know, the kind of former colonial powers, at least in outside of the six counties, and the kind of legislative legacies, they're one important part of the story. They're not the only part of the story, but they're that role of colonial legislation has been really fundamental to institutionalizing those anti-abortion practices across Ireland. I think that Offences Against the Person Act is a good way of thinking about the practices of colonial power and the enduring legacies of it. So what's all that got to do with China? China's it's a very different story, a very different history with abortion. So I'll just say a little bit about that before I come back and try and link it up a little bit more. But so in 1949, after the Chinese Communist Party came to power, abortion was seen very much as kind of an important part of the new government's policy making on population management. Right, so population control and demographic goals were really at the heart of Chinese state policy, you know, unexpectedly more so than reproductive justice or anything like that. So it's very much touching on some of the demographic anxieties that Jenny spoke about earlier. And the most explicit example of that is the one-child policy from the late 1970s into the up until just a few years ago. And the one-child policy was about limiting the great majority of family units across the country to one child each, in order to reduce the growth rate of China's population. So again, very much about population control. But that's just to kind of set the scene a little bit for what I want to talk about with Tibet and the Uyghur region. So it's just kind of giving you a sense of what the general approach of the Chinese state has been to reproductive rights. It's very much been about broader political imperatives and serving broader political goals. And it's very much true in the case of those colonial and contested areas such as Tibet and the Uyghur region, where the Chinese state has quite different political goals to the rest of the People's Republic of China. And so Tibet and the Uyghur region, they both represent points of particular sensitivity for the Chinese state. They're both very different in many different ways, but their similarities, in terms of their similarities, they're both occupied areas. They're both sites of various uprisings, independence movements at different points in time since the establishment of the People's Republic of China, and before that, going way back as well. Strong religious and cultural practices, distinct from the Han majority in China, and also strategic value as kind of borderland regions, right? So getting into some of the kind of military concerns as well. So they've both been targets of state efforts to assimilate and to control and to civilize. And I think much of that, you know, all of this feeds into this kind of the ongoing political and economic and social and cultural inequalities and conflicts and so on, and of course the unrest as well. But particularly since 2001, particularly since the kind of the global war on terror has kind of emerged. I mean, that's something that China has really latched on to pursue its own domestic goals. But the Tibet protests in the spring of 2008 and the Urumqi demonstrations in the summer of 2009, and all of that coupled with this kind of fierce ideological turn within the Chinese Communist Party that emphasizes the consolidation of overall political security. All of this has led to a kind of greater form of repression and pressure to assimilate, and heightened state security and widespread and arbitrary detention across both Tibet and the Uyghur region. And so reproductive injustice is a really central pillar of that state violence and that kind of Chinese state imperialism, ongoing imperialism across Tibet and the Uyghur region. And so, you know, this is kind of bringing together the reality for Tibetans and for Uyghurs of living under this Han-centric state and also state patriarchy, right? And how it kind of produces this kind of state where their bodies have become this important locus in the Chinese state's push for social regulation, for control, for expansion of state power. And so there are lots of examples of this. One example would be how the state's family planning laws play out in Tibet, how the one-child policy, for example, has played out in Tibet. So for many Tibetans, for Tibetan people who can get pregnant, language barriers, hand supremacy, among medics, for example, all of that has often resulted in a lack of proper explanation, poor understanding around issues of contraception, abortion, and even sterilization. And of course, it's a reproductive healthcare system that's built up around Han Chinese socio-cultural norms and ideas and state practices and so on that really cut against traditional Tibetan medicine, for example, or they run up against ideas of karma or rebirth and general notions of well-being. So it's it's an example of quite a coercive mechanism of cultural assimilation in that sense. And I'm aware of the time, so I'll move on a little bit. But I think to think about the situation of the Uyghurs, particularly over the last few years, the mass internment of somewhere between 1 and maybe 1.5 million Uyghurs in these so-called re-education camps as part of the party state's efforts in de-extremification. That's had such an enormous impact on Uyghur lives in basically all aspects of that you can think of. And as part of those efforts, forced marriages between Uyghur women and Han men, Han Chinese men, state intrusion into homes, disappearance of entire families, separation of children from parents, and reports of torture and death within the camps. They all reflect the ongoing horror and the trauma of this kind of everyday state violence and state and imperialism in the Uyghur region today. And of course, there are also widely cited reports of forced sterilization, fitting people who can get pregnant with contraceptive devices as well. And this idea that this is kind of part of a government campaign to suppress birth rates among Uyghurs. So all of these kind of reproductive injustices are, they're very much systemically produced harms. They work to sustain cultures of violence, and they're central to maintaining and consolidating that kind of settler colonial configuration of power as well. So those are stories of reproductive injustice in two very different contexts. Each obviously grows out of very different and unique, perhaps not so unique, different historical circumstances responding to very different experiences of empire. In Ireland, it was the sweeping restrictions on access to abortion. In China, it's forced abortion and sterilization. And so they, in some ways they seem like polar opposites, but I think they have much more in common than they have in different. Both are instances of state violence and control over ideas and practices of sex, of bodies, of family. It's all about, as Zeynep was saying as well, this is structuring human behavior, structuring ideas of life, of nation, and all of these, right? So it's an imposition of a very particular moral order that serves to deepen and expand and entrench colonial control. And so very much, I think this is an instance that both Ireland and China, in their own very different but very connected ways, I think are helpful in terms of thinking through the kind of the anti-choice policy, anti-choice practices and discourse as tools of empire, as practices of domination, and as ways of consolidating empire as well. So I'll leave it at that, and I'll pass it back to the panel for the Q&A.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, everyone. Zeynep, you seem to have dropped off and then rejoined us via telephone. I hope you can still hear us and you're still sort of with us.
Yes, I'm an active participant in everything. Unfortunately, I had some technological issues, but everything can be resolved with a landline, which is why I'm reaching you this way.
The show must go on, and here we are. There's no questions in the Q&A yet, so I would encourage participants and audience members to pitch in with your questions. But just as someone who was fascinated to hear all of your contributions, perhaps I can kick things off with a question of my own, which is to do with this kind of Silvia Federici type line of thinking, right? Where in Caliban and the Witch, as I understand it, she attempts to look at the Marxist concept of primitive accumulation, and then she tries to apply a kind of gendered lens to that, and she looks at the way that this kind of witch burning relates to the Marxist concepts of primitive accumulation, right? And then I guess I also found myself thinking about different theories of imperialism. And so the dominant theory within the Marxist tradition continues to start from Lenin and Lenin's famous pamphlet on imperialism. But then there have been kind of liberal iterations. There's people like Niall Ferguson who've come up with a kind of almost like liberal justification for empire, which is that it creates this kind of stable order. So there are competing definitions of empire. And Jenny, when you were speaking, you talked about kind of what you might almost call imperialists, right? People at the top of the imperial hierarchy, people at the commanding heights or whatever, who are using the language of imperialism, and they're almost happy to justify it, right? They're talking about this Niall Ferguson type idea of empire as justified. So I suppose what I'm interested in getting all of your views on is, I know that Federici's been criticized as a historian, but her fundamental project of like attempting to kind of update Marxist categories that come to us from the big canonical Marxist texts like Capital Volume 1, is primitive accumulation number one, and is empire and imperialism specifically. Like, are those still the categories that we're using, or do we need to update those categories to take account of the modern realities that you're speaking about? I don't know who wants to go first.
Why don't we structure this so Jenny goes first, and then me, and then Shay, like as we did the panel. So Jenny, you go ahead.
Yeah. So I quoted one of these neocons who was very open about the U.S. being an empire. There are many others, and I think the most striking admittance that the U.S. was an empire, I think, was in around 2002. There was a New York Times Magazine cover that was imperialism, empire, get used to it, article by Michael Ignatieff saying, you know, the U.S. empire is a good thing, you know, Pax Americana, blah, blah, blah. So, so they have been much more open, I think, since starting with the fall of the Soviet Union, but really since 9/11, you know, in justifying why the U.S. needs 1,600 bases in other countries, why the U.S. needs to have occupations in 80 countries, why half of the U.S. budget is spent on the military, and why we can't have good things at home because we have to have this military defending abroad. So I think it's I would say we can still use the basic Marxist analysis of U.S. imperialism. I don't think there's much updating that really needs to be done. With Federici, I mean, the interesting things to me about her stuff is that we're, you know, I think that there really hasn't been a good materialist explanation of the work that we do when we produce babies and when we produce and raise children. It isn't counted as work. It's not been really thought about. You know, we use this general term, social reproduction, but that means sort of everything that gets you back to work the next day, right? But we haven't done a really good job of talking about the various elements of that, and how that plays out in our current world is that we don't see all of the value that's produced by parenting, and so when schools are pulled out from under us by COVID, and we're all having to care for the kids at home and essentially do the schooling at home, although there are teachers desperately trying through Zoom to educate our kids, right? It's somehow confusing that the whole economics of that is confusing to people. They don't see how schools are this enormous contribution, and it just I think that's why we're having a little bit of trouble sort of looking at this situation and seeing the lines of control and the lines of economy in it. So I think that's I think what Federici is bringing to this, and it's very important.
Yeah, so I guess I'll go next. I mean, I have a lot of issues with Federici's framework that mainly arise from my wholly Marxian, I will condition this, objection to dialectical materialism and historical materialism as an approach. Not because I doubt the Marxist project as a whole, but more because I have serious doubts about some of the intellectual tools that Marxist scholars, I guess now including myself, will use, since I think it closes out certain realities of the world and also inevitably makes certain things difficult to theorize. This whole thing about social reproduction is one very good example. I mean, ultimately at the end of the day, the Marxist core Marxist ideas about labor and value are in some ways insufficient to theorize the reality of what goes on in the heterosexual family, right? And that now in the homosexual family, I suppose, and in the queer family, there's various different kinds of ways that labor and capital inform the ways that people have sex and the ways that people raise children, the purposes of sex terminating in children that are extremely complicated and are in many ways under-theorized. So I'm not going to fault individual theorists for what I see as shortcomings in the general approach, because my personal opinion on this is that a lot of it arises from a very flawed 18th century understanding of many core ideas of what rhetoric is and what institutions are that Marxists tend to inherit even hundreds of years later, and a lot of that needs to be rethought. I will point out here, because I think it's essential for understanding Northwest Pakistan and Afghanistan, which are sites of frequent armed conflict these days, that primitive accumulation as a term is not really the correct translation of what that term is in the original German. I personally had a lot of issues back when I was an Islamist conservative with the Marxian approach because, and one of them was that I thought this whole idea of primitive accumulation means that you're implying that there's something that you're making a value judgment about certain kinds of people when you're just primitive accumulation processes happened in England in so and so year, and then they happened in China 250 years later, right? But the German term doesn't necessarily mean primitive accumulation. It's more about the initial foundational processes that are needed for accumulation to take place. So I mean, that's a little bit different, right? Because you can talk about foundational things that are needed for capitalist pursuit of profit and for the marketplace to function that need to be constantly refreshed all the time. So I mean, it's this is something that I don't really get from Federici that I think is important, right? And certainly does overlap considerably with the framework. Is that you constantly need to refresh certain things in order for capitalism to work and in order for modern countries to govern themselves in the 18th century, 19th century European style. And among those many things that needs to constantly be refreshed are particular ideas of family, of sex, and of nation. Right? This is part of the reason why if you're trans or non-binary, for example, part of the struggle is that like you constantly need to stand up for yourself as somebody who exists outside the gender binary, or like subverts it somehow, or like has a different understanding of gender than the dominant understanding of gender wherever you live. And a large part of the reason why is because gender is constantly enforced and reinforced in daily life, right? And people reinforce gender on each other in similar ways to how institutions reinforce gender ideas on society at large, and ideas of like gender arising from biological sex, the notion that biological sex is even particularly concrete. These things are like kind of stated and then restated and then restated all the time. So what I would say in relation to Silvia Federici is that like I agree with the argument in Caliban and the Witch that this process of initial accumulation like was marked by this period of extreme violence, right? Like against like men and women, based on how they were like whether insiders or outsiders, like in society at large, like it is, and like certainly in Pakistan, like and I've seen this with my own family members, but also just people we know, that like capitalism in Pakistan and in Afghanistan definitely like enters new phases at the same time as, say, like acid attacks and chopping women up with axes, or like the one time I remember when somebody just got up at a wedding and shot this like wedding singer in the face, like this like sort of extreme violence against women, but also like the obsessive violence against like the Pakistani Taliban that has animated Pakistan lately. Like all of this sort of like says something about how capitalism is operating in these places, and capitalist tension does tend to be navigated through like the bodies of people who are designated as female. Whether or not they are female is another question, right? As well as like ultra violence against men, like and it constantly happens over and over again, like and that is the point I want to emphasize.
Very good. And Séagh?
And over the shape.
Yeah, really brief, because I have to admit I'm not so familiar with Federici's work, but I guess the point I think about when thinking about how words like primitive accumulation or empire, for example, how they apply to China, is that they often feel like they come with such a weight of assumptions of how the world works and how capitalism works. And I guess I often think that those historical specificities of empire are really important to bear in mind, and historical specificities of how capitalism emerges and evolves in different contexts. And then also, picking up on some of the points that Zainab also talked about, the kind of, the 18th century understandings of kind of core ideas of institutions. They're Western institutions we're talking about as well. They emerge out of very particular contexts. And how ideas of the realities of heterosexual, homosexual family, how they kind of feel under theorized when it comes to ideas of labor and value, which I guess, Jenny, you were kind of picking up on that. And again, how that translates then into the Chinese context. I mean, I think that's something that I don't really have great answers for. I just have a lot of questions about how to think about some of these questions in China, where it's not like it's such a unique context, not by any means. I mean, it's part and parcel of global capitalism, but it's just that how these things kind of play out in a particular context is something that I think we also need to take care of.
Brilliant. We have a question from an anonymous attendee, which the panelists will be able to read, but I'll just read it out so that we're all on the same page. So the attendee asks, would you consider that there is a direct link between the desire to increase population and the lack of concrete legislation around pornography? So should we do same again, Jenny, Zainab, then Séagh?
Yeah, in the US, boy, I don't think it really tracks. I think I tend to think that that really the focus of getting increasing the birth rate in the U.S. is much more around making birth control inconvenient and difficult to get, and that's been the focus. I don't think that legislation around pornography has been that related. Although Zainab may have a different view on that. I would be interested to hear what she has to say about it.
Yeah, I mean, it's like obviously the links here are very complicated. I mean, like in the Pakistani and Afghani case, like the official opposition to like online pornography actually shares a lot in common with the official opposition to blasphemous portrayals of the Prophet Muhammad, right? And the reason I say that is because like the laws that are used to regulate the internet tend to bounce between those two things, which is, you know, I mean, like I realize this isn't the place to get like too theoretical about that, but if you think about it in terms of like religious images and then like these images of like women's bodies, as well as the like ban on portraying the Prophet Muhammad's body, like then you get something that's genuinely really interesting, right? Like then the fact that like you know, like a pregnant person may be a woman, maybe not, like is allowed to do in relation to like their pregnancy, like I mean, inevitably, like it's impacted by all these other moral ideas, right? But also, I mean, like in the Pakistani and Afghan case, like a lot of like conservative Islamist morality from the state has actually gathered steam initially through these like different ways of like protecting like the Islamic religion as a whole, and like recently, in addition to this like ridiculous war that the Pakistani military is fighting in northwest Pakistan as an extension of like the continued ridiculous policies of NATO member states in Afghanistan, like a large part of what has generated like the moral energy, like in addition to like military onslaught, has been this like push to protect society at large from improper portrayals of the Prophet Muhammad, and in particular the fact that you're seeing the Prophet Muhammad at all. Like so yeah, like I mean that's what I'll say about this, like is like to encourage people to think not just about like the ways that like conservative morality are like is like impacted by pornography legislation. And I will also note that like mainstream pornography is terrible for like sex workers, like so you know, just think about it as like a labor relationship as well. Like in the Pakistani and Afghan case, like there's like a direct link between like what people are allowed to do with their bodies and like how pregnancy is managed and thought about, and portrayals of the Prophet Muhammad. So like over to Shay.
Shay's had to disappear, which she's mentioned in the chat, and I think we've run slightly over our 7:30 target, so maybe I'll just give Jenny a chance to share any final thoughts that she may have, and then hand over to you, Zainab, to for the final word, so to speak.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention that a lot of I developed this my presentation a little bit more in my book Birth Strike, and National Women's Liberation you can check out our website at womensliberation.org. We're doing a lot around the abortion struggle right now in the United States, if you're interested in that. So womensliberation.org, and the book is Birth Strike by Jenny Brown. Thanks.
Zainab?
Yeah, so firstly, like I want to say that like the Uyghurs and Chinese policy in Xinjiang has come up several times. Like you can find me writing about like Xinjiang a little bit in the online journal Made in China. Made in China will also be like publishing more content about Xinjiang in the future coming forward, including a book that I have contributed to, like that was delayed like slightly as a result of the pandemic. What I also want to just wrap up saying briefly, because I didn't have a chance to say this. I mean, like I talked a lot, so my fault really. Like Frank brought up Caliban and the Witch by Silvia Federici, a book I recommend that everybody reads, despite my objections to some of it. But also, I mean, it's like the core idea there is that like the oppression and violence of like women who, well, like people who are designated as women within like households and within like local communities in the imperial core is directly linked to the violence that is faced by people who are designated as men outside of the imperial core or like within these countries, but just like given outsider status. So, you know, like people who are designated as terrorists, right? And like this is something that comes up over and over again in my research, and I want people to internalize it, right? Is that like there, it's gotten really weirdly fashionable to hate on like annoying middle class white women, like on the left, both in Britain and in the United States. And obviously, I have patience for that because I hate white people. But also, I mean, it's like really important to understand that like sexist restrictions on like white women in like the dominant countries of the world is directly linked and reinforced by violent policies against decidedly non-white men who operate violently elsewhere.
That's suitably.
And that's all
yeah, well, you've definitely left us thinking with that last comment. So I think we will leave it there. Thanks very much to everyone for joining us, and we hope that you all enjoy the rest of your Friday and Friday evening for those of you who are in the same time zone as me, and hopefully see you at another event very soon.
Thanks, Frank. Thanks, Zainab.
Thanks, Frank.
See you soon. Bye-bye.